Great. Hello and welcome. Um, Thank you for being here. We are members of the Village Preservation Archives Committee who are going to engage in a conversation about the documentation process for federal row houses in the late 20th century. I'm Vicki Weiner. I am a former director of what was then the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, now at Pratt. And I am joined by Jay Shockley, who was a longtime research staff member at the Landmarks Preservation Commission from 1979 to 2015, and Susan Vries, who is an architectural researcher and photographer who was a staff member, first an intern and then a staff member at then Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation in the 90s. And both of them have been very engaged in researching and documenting the very fragile collection, if you will, of federal row houses that exist and existed, many of them lost, below 14th Street in Manhattan. And while we were prepping to talk about this with a recording going, Jay reminded us that Greenwich Village has the largest assembly of federal era row houses left in the city. And for village preservation, this is an issue both of documentation of the history of preservation and really wanting to record and document the process by which some of this research took place and what it accomplished and what we lost. But also, I know in thinking about advocacy going forward, thinking about how to continue to support these really wonderful, important buildings that are, many of them, in a state of disrepair. So we have a group of questions that we've assembled that we're going to talk through. We're going to really start just by, capturing the background of how this research projects began in the 1980s. And I'm going to kick it over to you, Jay, to talk about your involvement when at LPC and how that all began.
Thank you. So again, I started at the Landmarks Commission in 1979. I went in the early years, I was there in a number of different capacities. I started out on researching Olmsted landscapes, and then I was on the survey staff, and then Kent Barwick, who was the chair in the late 70s, early 80s, rearranged the landmark staff into geographic staffs. And then when Gene Norman came in 1983, he reorganized the commission staff back into survey, research, and preservation departments. So in my years as in the survey department and then in the research department, settling in the mid 1980s, another staff member, Laura Alamo, who couldn't be on this call today, unfortunately, she and I found out that we both had a pet passion for federal houses in Manhattan, basically because these are the earliest remnants other than the Dyckman House in Upper Manhattan, which is a Dutch farmhouse. Federal row houses in Manhattan are the oldest remnants of the settlement of Manhattan Island by the English. So we realized that there were lots and lots of these buildings that were not protected. And we got interested in trying to see if we could get permission together to create a federal row house project. And we personally went to Gene Norman when he was designated the chair of the Landmarks Commission and actually got permission from him to spend the two of us working 1 day a week on this project. By that point, I believe I had become the deputy director of the research department, and Laura Alamo became a deputy director in the preservation department. So we really had to plead our case. And the thinking then, frankly, inside the commission staff was that, well, why is this important? Why does this matter? Aren't the best ones already designated? Given the fact that the 1969 Greenwich Village Historic District, which is quite large, then there's the Charlton King Van Dam Historic District south of there, that's three different block fronts of federal houses. And there were a smattering of individual designations of federal houses. So what we ended up having to do in this project was a whole variety of different tasks. Number one was to actually look at the designated federal houses that the commission had already done, whether they were in historic districts or individually designated. And for instance, in that exercise, when you really look at the federal houses in Charlton, King, Van Dam, there are very few of them that are intact. Almost all of them in the Greek Revival period or in the Italianate period had upper stories, had new cornices put on, and so on. So that was one factor that we had to look at the designated properties. Then number two was to come up with a roster of all of the properties we could find, either in the files, going through the few books like Ada Louise Huxtable or whatever, people that had been interested in federal houses, and physically just as we were going about the city as part of our survey department duties, or just where we lived or whatever else, we started compiling an extensive list, files, and so on. And as part of that, the third part was really coming up with a methodology of what is a federal house. And that actually was the most important thing, because basically, just so we and commission staff people, the administrators of the commission, and ultimately the commissioners would know that the basic grammar of a federal row house in New York, and there are clearly exceptions, these were relatively modest. There are some very grand ones in the Greenwich Village Historic District, but by and large, they're two-story row houses, red brick. Sometimes they were frame construction with just brick facades. They almost always had federal or Flemish bond brickwork. And they had simple cornices, sometimes more elaborate cornices. And they almost across the board had dormers on the top. So sometimes they had their, and then we determined there was a chronological flow of the lintel type. The very earliest survivals in Manhattan have a keystone in the middle and have splayed lintels out of stone.
Could
And
you
then
say what the date ranges
well,
for each of these
yes,
are roughly?
those that we identified, the earliest surviving ones in Manhattan are from the 1780s and 1790s. And I think literally those splayed keystone lintels, and Susan may correct me later, but those basically are only in 1780s and 1790s. By around 1800 up to 1810 or so, the most common type was incised lintels that had sort of a rectangular incising with little corner blocks. And then there were variations on that. Sometimes you had slightly pedimented lintels that were still federal. A little bit confusing when you determine federal houses. Lintels in subsequent decades were frequently, they were vulnerable because they were stone, and a lot of times they were replaced. So it's not always immediately apparent of what you're looking at was actually original to the federal house period. And sometimes amazingly clever. There's a row in Greenwich Village that were done individually. 127, 129, and 131 McDougal Street on the west side of McDougal Street. I happen to do the designation reports for those. When you look at them at first, you swear that those are federal lintels, but in fact they're cast iron. That in the cast iron period, probably 1850s, they actually mimic what would have been a convincing federal lintel. So again, going back to the grammar of what these were, once we determined that those were the basic materials of what a federal row house looked like, we went with our list. And as we'll talk about when Susan and I get into a conversation about them, there were a bunch on our original survey list that are recognizable as federal houses if you know to look for them. But in the later 19th century, they were made into tenements by being raised 2 or 3 stories. So those were already altered. as I've said, the simpler type of alteration, as per the ones in Charlton King Van Dam, they were only raised a story or so with a new cornice. Sometimes the federal houses that are still fully identifiable as a federal house had later cornices put on. Those are very common types of just, you know, updates in taste, updates in when materials deteriorated, and so on. So that basically was our methodology, and that was our entire project, which was to counter the fact that the most important ones were already protected and designated, to come up with a survey of them and to develop the vocabulary of what it was that a federal row house was. So um, because it was 40 years ago, I'm not crystal clear how much time Laura and I actually had to work on this project, but it was somewhere probably between 6 months to a year at most. And then when Gene Norman left his chair, then we were pulled off being allowed to do this. But in all the subsequent years leading up to Susan, I literally, in the research department, I kept literally a federal house file. There was one file drawer that was my personal files on federal houses. And if the commission was going to get involved in any of those, they had to come to me and consult the federal house file drawer. And so I guess I'll just do a slight prelude into turning it over to Susan. But when Jennifer Rabb was appointed as chair, obviously internally, I, and by that point, the research department, were advocating for the protection of these things. I think the thinking by that point was that these definitely were worthy buildings. There were still tons of them sprinkled all over Lower Manhattan. And I didn't say, and I should have said, that we determined that besides the earliest survivors from the 1780s and 90s, basically the form of the federal house died out in 1835. And we found them all the way from the tip of Lower Manhattan all the way up into Chelsea. I don't think we found any at all in the area east of Chelsea, but that meant that there were ones in Soho, NoHo, Chinatown. The Bowery had a ton of them as one of Manhattan's earliest thoroughfares that went from Lower Manhattan all the way up. They were in all sorts of states of pristine, slightly altered in the 19th century, altered more recently, but we developed quite a list. And when Jennifer Rabb was appointed chair, she actually was just looking for projects for community groups to do. So I think when she was appointed chair, obviously Greenwich Village was starting to advocate for more protections for other areas that were not designated as part of the original 1969 historic district, which, by the way, was Manhattan's first large historic district. Far and away, all of the districts in Manhattan that were designated between 65, when the commission was designated, 1969, were all pretty diminutive size. So it was a big, very controversial thing at the time. And the commission was incredibly courageous to do one large district in 1969. That said, because of NYU's opposition to anything south of Washington Square, there were a lot of federal houses that ultimately got protected by, the 6 or so extensions to the Greenwich Village district, from, the extension 1, extension 2, South Village, Sullivan Thompson, the Meatpacking District, and so on. So many of those were done many years later. But so I'll turn it over to Susan, and I believe she's going to pick up with how she got involved. And I believe that a portion of our survey was turned over to her basically south of 14th Street.
Before we turn to Susan, I have 2 questions.
Uh-huh.
You want to just answer kind of briefly is fine. One, what was in that file drawer exactly? If you could describe the contents, just in general terms. And 2, remind us how this kind of survey happened in the 1980s, what technologies you did or did not have to go find these buildings, and talk a little bit about how it is you identify. I'm assuming you guys were walking up and down the streets, but if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, the survey methodology back in those days was all over the place. The commission, when I first started, and for years afterwards, was actively getting summer interns. They were getting just volunteers in the community who want something to do to assist the commission. I mean, trust me, if everybody knows that the commission now is understaffed and underfinanced, back in those days, it was severely so. Um, so the commission really tried to rely on community people that were just interested because they lived in an area. They were probably interested ultimately in getting a historic district protection. But as helpful as they were, particularly in terms of federal houses, it's so specific. A lot of people that were just community volunteers would look at these things and, well, that's a dumpy old house. I'm not interested in that. So that wasn't particularly helpful. Um, and there for a few years, there was a lot of federal block grant money that was given to the commission for survey. A woman named Meredith Sykes headed up what was the first computerized survey. Um, and a great deal of effort was put into that. But unfortunately, way pre-computerization days, the city only had one central computer for the entire city. So the data that was compiled for the commission surveys went to other people that entered it. And if they typed in the wrong number, it could change it from a federal house into a tenement. I mean, it was that specific. So the actual data from that survey ended up being virtually useless. But the incredible thing that was compiled in those days was there was an attempt to photograph every single building in Manhattan. And as part of that, not only is there this photographic file, um, between people doing that and so on, obviously there became more of an awareness of really what was surviving in Manhattan. That said, when Laura and I started the program, and you were asking what was in the file drawer, it was anything that we could find that existed in the research files. Sometimes it was, there was an incredible photographer named John Barrington Bailey, who on his own just went out and photographed the city of New York. And he was an excellent photographer. He had an old-fashioned box camera on a tripod. He donated his entire photographic collection to the commission. And for a number of years, he actually was hired by the commission. For instance, in the early 70s, when Soho was designated, he produced all the photographs for the commission of the Soho Historic District. So we had a lot of incredible mid-60s photography of federal houses that we put on our files. If um, apparently in the pre-commission days, there was a predecessor commission before the law went in effect that most people don't remember about, that lasted between 1963 and 1965. And during that period, Regina Kellerman, who was the first executive director of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation, she had people doing not technical National Register survey forms, but they were basically sort of certain early survey forms that were useful, and a bunch of those were on federal houses. Some of them in the Greenwich Village area. There were a whole bunch of identifiable federal houses on Bleecker Street, just south of the Greenwich Village Historic District, and some of those had survey forms. So again, the famous Federal House file drawer had everything we could compile, photographs, our survey notes. And again, what Laura and I did was, either as part of our jobs or just as we moved about the city, every single time, it's another, oh my God, there's another federal house we didn't know about. We would take notes on it, create a file on it, and that's basically how it evolved.
That's great. Great. Thank you. Susan, you want to pick up the story from there?
Sure, although I think um, actually you would come first, right? Like I was an intern at then
Mhm.
GVSHP. I started in the fall of 1994. And in my memory, it was the spring of 1995 that GVSHP kind of got approached by the commission.
Right.
Um, but I think that you would have had that conversation probably. And I remember
Yeah.
getting a fax,
Oh,
actually
yes.
faxed list.
Yes, yes, yeah. I think Jay's memory is accurate about Jennifer's tenure at the commission where, she was looking for ways to, in a way, relieve the workload of staff and kind of get ahead of requests that were coming in. There was a backlog of different unfinished projects and calendared but never heard, or heard and never acted on. Like she was, in a way, part of what her tenure was under. I forget who was the director under General. Was it Terry Rosendeutsch? I don't remember.
There were a bunch of them.
Yeah. But I think they were looking to finish some work that was unfinished. And I think, Regina Kellerman was still on our board at the Greenwich Village Society when I became the director and was still very active. And I think a number of the board members were very keen on continued designation and the vulnerabilities of some of the buildings and different building typologies. And somehow I don't have an exact memory of the call that precipitated them sending us this list, but I think that's actually quite right that we were tapped as an organization to, could we look into whether these still existed and what kind of conditions they were in, is my recollection.
And again, this is totally parallel to that, but besides, in quotes, relieving staff of certain things to do, she wanted certain neighborhood groups to do something instead of just bugging the commission and proselytizing for designations. So
Exactly.
it was a very clever and ultimately
Mhm.
useful because
Yeah,
it did pan out. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so, yeah, so there was this faxed list of about 108 or so buildings below 14th Street, um, river to river, pretty much. And the agreement, as I recall, was that I would spend my summer going and walking by each of the buildings and photographing them, because of course this was pre Google Maps, this was pre digital anything. So again, much like Jay, you had when you were doing the survey work, like the best way was to walk past them and photograph them and just provide a baseline of how many of these still exist, um, and what condition are they in, basically. So that was how I spent that summer of 1995, which was my first summer living in New York City. So it was a great way to walk almost, I think I walked every street below 14th Street. And again, having to map them out ahead of time without the benefit of anything, figuring out where they were, and then just basically discovering them, because there was no, here's what the building looks like. It was no, go to this address and see if you can find the building, which was rather fun. And it was a hot summer, as I remember. And I learned what neighborhoods I should carry a clipboard and look official in, and what neighborhoods I shouldn't carry a clipboard. Um, and I think we did that first round of photography and then had a meeting and presented the slides to the commission. I think you were at that meeting, Jay,
Yeah.
and Marjorie Pearson, I think.
right.
And we just basically went through, here's the status. And there were some indeed that were gone, but not as many as I expected, actually. I think there were just a few that had been demolished on that list, which was kind of amazing. And they really were spread. There were a lot on the Lower East Side, Chinatown, but there were also some, like you said, in the Village and in Lower Manhattan, all the way down on Greenwich. And so I think then at that meeting, we kind of created a priority list of which ones should I go back and re-photograph, but really zoom in on the details. So, and I actually still have all my field notes from both that summer of 95 and then the next round, where basically I was just kind of sketching the buildings and then, making a note about what was on the storefront, if there was a storefront, what shop was in there, and then did they have lintels, did they have dormers, what could I tell? Because I was still learning. I, didn't have, Jay, your knowledge at that point. So I was kind of learning what to look for and how to photograph them, and using my eye to walk around the building and see what I spotted. So in my memory, we did another slideshow with the commission showing close-ups of lintels, of dormers, anything I could get with my new zoom lens, to show them and then kind of make some further decisions. Vicki, does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
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 And
my question to you, Susan,
Yeah.
sorry if I'm jumping ahead and you're
No.
going to say this. You, to all the viewers out there, she sent us some materials to prep for this ahead of time. What you didn't send was the ultimate ring binder booklet that was GVSHP's proselytizing tool for these are the most important ones. Let's have these designated. Do you remember how many was on that final list?
That is a good question, because that was actually post me.
Okay.
So I remember contributing that and like sharing my thesis and stuff like that. But I think the production of that came after me. And actually, also the landmarks, New York Landmarks Conservancy also produced something. If you remember their endangered building project.
Right.
And they also produced a list of kind of endangered buildings, and there were a lot of federal. So I remember contributing to both.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I thought that ring binder, which seemed to be the main tool ultimately, our survey getting honed down by you with all these meetings, whatever, but I always thought for sure that that was your product. But
no, I mean, I think it had a lot of my stuff in there, but
yeah.
it was, I think I was an intern, then became a staff member, and I think left in 1999, I want to say. So that might have come out in the early 2000s or something like that.
So that
Or
was
maybe,
after you and I had both left.
yeah, yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about how you went from this intern project to exploring this more deeply as a thesis?
Sure. I was actually contemplating that last night when I was looking at your notes. I was like, it kind of ended up because my early thesis consideration was theaters in Greenwich Village, because there had been a research project about that, and I had done a ton of research, and there were some theaters still standing in Union Square at the time, and that got demolished in 1995. So when we had this photography opportunity and I was spending so much time with the buildings and walking around and getting to know all these neighborhoods, it just seemed a very logical thesis project. And so I ended up doing not so much research on the history of each individual building, which, Jay, as you know, when you're dealing with these buildings like that, especially pre-digital research, was a monumental task. So I did kind of post-thesis spend a ton of time doing that research. But for the thesis, it was really about what is this typology? Why is it important? What various studies, like Jay's work, there was a Lee Roberts study, there's Ada Louise Huxtable, who produced a volume about these buildings, like, and why are they surviving and why are some not designated? So that ended up being my thesis. And then I actually ended up, and I still kind of go back and visit the buildings and have been photographing them kind of ever since.
And
Yeah.
what is your recollection of the National Register effort?
I think we had conversations about doing the non-contiguous district.
Yeah.
That we could do a federal row house. What is it? It's multiple
Multiple
properties.
property listing. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we had that conversation. I remember going up to People's Island and chatting with people.
Yes.
I think we just didn't have the resources to
Yeah.
do the full, nomination,
Mhm.
which is a regret that we kind of didn't do that.
Yeah.
And then the focus, I think, became more on local designation.
Yeah. Yeah. That is, do you recall we went to Troy
Yeah.
after our
Mhm.
visit with people at People's Island and
Yeah.
got a great tour of Troy with
Yes. Peter Shaver.
Peter Shaver. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to swing back to something that she just mentioned that I should have is, of all the research tasks that one can do, researching federal houses is quite difficult, particularly in all those years. I mean, the internet may be useful for some of that stuff, but you have to go to early land records, you have to go to early tax records, and you have to compare all these and direct early directories.
Yeah.
It's basically the triangulation between when somebody shows up in a directory, when a property was sold, and a tax evaluation, if you can find that, to pinpoint when these things were actually constructed. So it's
Yeah.
it's 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 a lot different research.
It is, and it was a lot of, because addresses and street names sometimes changed as
all
well. I
all
spent
the
a
time.
lot of time at the municipal archives using the tax assessment records on microfilm, which is still required if you want to do that early research. And basically starting in the 1890s and going backwards to like have a baseline, this is the building, and then just keep going backwards and hoping you can figure out when that lot has a hot house and lot, or
Yeah.
when the assessment value changed. So it's really, I mean, now it's easier to do the mapping research digitally, but you're right, it doesn't change the having to go through those tax assessment records. That's a
And
bit.
from what I've understood, since I retired in 2015, they've moved the conveyance books out of Manhattan.
Yeah. So it's, yeah, so that, I did a certain amount of that for my thesis. And then afterwards, I did a lot on those buildings that eventually ended up in that binder. I did a lot of the tax assessment research. I probably would come to different conclusions now than I did then, right? Just with more research experience under my belt.
That's
Um,
interesting. What
yeah,
kind of, how different, what ways do you think your conclusions might have been different?
I think
Be
just
different now.
I think you just with time you become better at thinking analytically, and a little bit more about the neighborhoods, that you can know what was going on when, what makes sense, and just more access to resources now, perhaps, um, and hopefully more in my brain that I've saved. I don't know. I don't know about that. But one of the things that I did as part of my thesis was see those magical files of Jay's. So I have very clear memories of going to the commission, Jay allowing me to go through those files. I got copies of some of those photographs that you mentioned, so I still have those.
That's right.
And then I also, what my memory, what was so fascinating in those files that you had compiled was for certain buildings, like the wonderful stretch on Canal Street, there were, letters on file from like Robert Moses saying, ugh, please don't bother with these buildings because they were in the way of a project. Or there were the wonderful um, houses on Lower Greenwich, 94, 94 and a half,
Yeah.
96,
Yeah.
which had been heard but not designated. And there were wonderful, you had wonderful things in the files, including letters of objection from the owner's lawyers in the 60s. And so that, for me, for my thesis, was really great because it showed, look, these were considered important, but it just didn't make it. And now only one of those is individually designated.
No,
The others were
they're both designated.
two, okay, but not one of them. There are three in that stretch. Yeah. Um, so yeah, like that, those research files were really important because it brought all of that information together. And then, you allowed me to photocopy some things and photograph some things, which was great.
So
Yeah.
when we think of like all of the different materials that you both produced, between the research, the photography, maps, compilations of information of archival material. What material exists today, and where do we know where this material is? Like what would you, if you, what would you say is the inventory of resources that we have about the federal houses that still we know where it is?
Well, in terms of the commission, I actually don't have a clue. As I
Okay.
said, from 85 until 2015, when I retired, I kept that federal house file intact. And the commission has moved so many times and the staff has changed so many times. I doubt if it stayed intact as a federal house file, which is too bad because it's such a specific topic. It was inordinately helpful to have that as a totality. None of the material would have disappeared, but if it's been sprinkled around by address, filing, or whatever else, then it's only as helpful as it is. But
Although we haven't
it,
asked, I don't think anyone's asked them if this file is still intact. It would be an interesting question. We should probably ask the research staff today if they know of this documentation.
I still have the photocopies of things that I made from your files. So I have some photographs and photocopies of some of the letters and things. So I still have building files with that in there. No, I wasn't able to obviously copy everything, so I don't have the full extent, but at least some of it.
Mm-hmm. And Jay, did you keep any of it? Since some of it was your personal research, was there any of it that you continued to research after you left the commission, or
well,
took with
the,
you?
the one unsaid thing that was which I actually don't think we've quite touched on yet, was what happened with all of these two parallel projects. And
Yeah.
ultimately, Susan very helpfully, prior to this meeting, sent out the original list that she had. And she looked at the entire list, and I looked for several hours this morning, went on Google Street Maps just to see what each of the properties looked like. And the good news is that many, probably the vast majority of all of the buildings on that list were ultimately designated as individual landmarks or in historic district extensions. Greenwich Village has had so many extensions. There are two NoHo districts. There was a Soho extension district. And so of that original list that Susan had, there have been a number of alterations, a number of demolitions. There, as I mentioned earlier, a number of the buildings had already been altered in the 19th century as tenements. I would guesstimate that there are a handful, maybe 4 to 6, that I still think are worthy of designation, that are not protected, and they're just, stray areas outside of protected areas. The tragic thing is, as we were discussing prior to recording, it's a tragedy to both Susan and me, because we had a fondness for the Bowery in particular, back between when she picked it up and when I had started the survey. The Bowery, probably as one single street, had the most amount of surviving federal houses, as one of the earliest thoroughfares that went all the way from the tip of Manhattan, up to basically up to Cooper Union. And very few of those are protected, and so many of them have been severely altered or demolished. So that was tragic, that sort of as a streetscape, that those ended up both under the flaws of the landmarks law ability to do something like that, with discontiguous properties that are sort of thematic rather than contiguous properties. So, but by and large, I'm really pleased at re-looking at the totality of the list, because at least on paper, and we'll pick up on this topic coming up, on paper, most of these are protected. But
Yeah, and
do you have a different feeling about that, Susan?
no, I think I just would say, Vicki, your original question about like where documentation lies, I guess I would just want to say about the list is that it was an amazing starting point of like 100 and so buildings, but isn't right. It isn't every single federal building in Manhattan. So that's something to think about. Um, and that, the photography that I did, some of that has been digitized, and I've retained all of my original stuff, both things that I did after working for Greenwich Village Society. And a lot of that, as Jay noted, was the affection for the Bowery, the Lower East Side, Grand Street, which is amazing. So I did a lot of kind of walking around there and discovering, oh, a lintel here, a little bit of Flemish bond there that still survives. So there's both the collection from the 90s, the slides that I took for then Greenwich Village, those have been digitized mostly. And Village Preservation has those online. I have my kind of additional collection of things, and then I have all my, folders on each building, that I have my original survey notes that I keep hanging on to instead of throwing out, kind of thing.
Well, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, there's still, and the buildings that still exist are also those that are undesignated or unprotected are still constantly changing and at risk. So, I might walk down Grand Street, in another year, and those will all be
Oh,
gone.
oh my
You
God.
just don't
Yeah.
know. There was a great project. Most of those buildings are within a number of National Register districts, Lower East Side. So I don't know if you remember, Jay, there was this great stretch all the way at the end of Grand by East Broadway. Like those were just like an amazing little stretch. Those were included in the National Register. They kind of skinnied the National Register district to go all the way
And
down.
and in going through them on Google Maps today, one or two of those were individually designated.
Yes, yeah, I
I,
think
I it was a tragedy they didn't do the row because they're
yeah,
so diminutive and so unusual.
it's just a wonderful little stretch. I think it's just like 511 and 513, if I remember, that were designated.
Right.
But it's a whole wonderful little stretch there. Yeah.
Yep.
In preparing for this conversation, actually, I should have shared this. I didn't share it, but I'm sure you, Susan, know about this, and maybe Jay, you do as well, that Village Preservation created it was actually before their name change, it must have been in 2016. They do have a document called Making the Case, which is on their website. Federal houses landmarked or listed on the state and national registers of historic places, 1999 to 2016. Which is a compilation of images and discussion, as we've been having, of which things ended up in which historic districts, which that was last updated, I think, in 2016. It's hard to tell if that has been updated since then. But Jay, your exercise this morning is pretty much the exercise that they went through in those, whenever this report was produced, to kind of identify which ones are protected and which ones are outliers and not protected. So I guess two questions, which are about like, what have we lost? What are the remaining threats to how many do we think are threatened, and this question of ones that have not yet been quote unquote discovered, that are probably maybe still extant but behind layers of signage or siding, or buried deep between beneath something with a lot of alterations. Susan, I do remember some of your images in those days from Chinatown, where there was one in particular where you said, look at this, it's there, the building is there, but there was a giant billboard sign. I
Modern
think you
decor.
found you
Yeah,
found like an angle to take the picture where you could see the dormer
yeah,
behind the sign.
they've
Yeah,
lost their dormers, and one in that row, at least one in that row is gone. But it was like my favorite row because you could look past the giant billboards,
yeah,
see a little bit of Flemish bond, and they still had their dormers. And
yeah,
they were such a wonderful part of the history of that streetscape.
yeah, yeah.
And Susan, I think um, if you still have your files on that, I think there was an early John Barrington Bailey photograph from the mid
Oh,
60s of that row. And
wow.
you
Yes.
could really tell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I used that in my thesis, maybe. I think so.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so you could see what they were. But I mean, to me, I loved those so much because they weren't perhaps what the commission was then looking for as far as the purity of form.
Right.
But to me, they showed the federal row house as kind of a workhorse of
Right.
the streetscape, that it was adapted by, different immigrant communities coming into the neighborhood. And, a floor was added, or, the storefront was changed, but it was still such an important part of that streetscape.
And
Yeah.
it's funny, exactly what you're describing. It's sort of the working class alternative to what ended up happening with the Harrison Street houses,
Yeah.
which were all early federal houses that were part of the Washington market that was demolished. And they were designated and then moved into this. It's quite wonderful, but it's a little mini Williamsburg over
Yeah.
restored houses next to these high-rise apartment buildings. I mean, they're important houses and they've been wonderfully restored, but they're really overly restored and
Right.
sort of
Out of their
faked it.
context.
And
Yeah.
they're
Yeah,
out
yeah,
of the
exactly.
context that
Yeah,
they were
Yeah.
originally constructed
yeah.
in. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Preserved, but some of the meaning is really altered by how they present today, right? You cannot get a
And
sense of the
and I
original.
don't know if either of you have ever seen those photographs. The commission owns a slew of photographs of those when they were still in situ as market buildings,
Mhm.
and
Yes. Yeah.
then up on flatbed trucks being rolled over to Harrison Street.
Wow.
It's
Wow.
it's it's really amazing process of
Yeah.
saving those and moving them. But
Yeah. Do you think that there is, sufficient evidence and, reason to kind of go back to this question of like a multiple property designation, or is there a way we can think of them as a group that we should be thinking about, either a policy application or somehow, a book? Maybe the two of you want to write a book. I don't know. Just saying.
Yeah.
Um, how do we sort of capture and continue to support the, preservation of some of these buildings and appreciation for them, even those that have been heavily altered?
well, if I could jump in, and we haven't exactly jumped into this aspect of it. I think Susan would back me up on this, and certainly Vicki would back me up on this. Just because they're designated, I think these are still among the most vulnerable properties in New York. Again, going to the very beginning of this conversation, these are the oldest remnants of settlement on Manhattan Island. And just because they're designated, we just lost a building on Gay Street in the Greenwich Village Historic District. And there was a cluster, I think it's 5 houses, were all built together going through Gay Street over to Christopher Street. Those are in terrible shape. They have scaffolding up right now. They are really, really vulnerable. The commission allowed, I will say, they would counter the use of that word, but I personally did the entire historic district for the Gansevoort Market Historic District. There was a whole row between 14th Street and 15th Street. They weren't technically federal houses, but they were row houses built at exactly the end of the federal row house period. Um, and the commission allowed a new building to go up in the back with no protections of these vulnerable buildings. And the buildings department required that the entire row be taken down. And I just saw them a week or two ago. The new construction is atrocious. They look fake. The windows are awful. The cornice is awful. The brickwork is awful. There is nothing that the commission did in having them reconstructed that is believable that these are old buildings. And then even some of the individually designated buildings, one of the oldest buildings in Lower Manhattan, 67 Greenwich Street, incredibly old, incredibly rare. It's one of the only federal houses that had a bowed rear on it. They allowed the entire building to be demolished except for the front wall and the rear wall. There's no insides of it. There's nothing left of the building other than these 2 walls.
Yeah. That
Um,
one is heartbreaking for me because there once were many of those bow-backed houses on Greenwich that were demolished for the construction of the tunnel. So it was really the one that was left.
And the family that owned it, it was incredibly important family, early Lower Manhattan family. So, and as we're finding out more and more and more, the commission in the last at least 10 or 15 years is only protecting facades. They're not protecting buildings. It's a problem all over the city, and it's not as widely talked about in preservation circles, but it's an absolute fact.
Mm.
So again, even if they're individually designated or even if they're in historic districts, because of the fragile nature of, they're usually frame, they're frame construction.
Right.
A lot of times it's only a brick front facade. Sometimes it's the rear facade and the front facade, but it's frame construction in between. And again, the commission allegedly with the buildings department has provided some sort of a document about how fragile buildings are supposed to be protected, but I personally haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but I'm a little bit leery that this is enough that's needed. So I think village preservation and other preservation groups, I would urge them to look at what is designated and protected, what's happened to them, how vulnerable they still are, and for things like the Gay Street and Christopher Street buildings and other ones, really lower the boom. That these something has to happen. These are too precious to lose.
Well, and just like you mentioned, Jay, the vulnerability because of, even adjacent construction. I mean, the Merchants House Museum is
Oh,
another
Mhm.
important example of one that obviously, was not on my list. It was already designated, but one that I studied and photographed as an example of what I needed to look at, which is now vulnerable to construction next door. And that, is something, if that's lost, that's lost.
Right. We're not getting that back.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a call to action of a sort. Are there groups that you know of? We have, of course, the wonderful local organizations like Village Preservation first and foremost, but that and the NoHo and Soho, like there are preservation groups. Are there other affinity groups that might be interested in this issue of this particular time period of house
the
that
interesting
might
thing,
join a
I didn't even
coalition?
think of it until now when you're asking the question, but HDC does annual lists of the most vulnerable properties.
Mm-hmm.
It might be worth joining village preservation and then joining together to have a look at this. And is that worth, that would at least put a spotlight on this question.
That's a really good point. Yep, they have the 6 to celebrate, right? Other groups, are there, is this something
Um,
that's of interest to the
yeah,
Society of Architectural Historians or
yeah.
AIA?
Local kind of just history buffs kind of. Also, I just wanted to mention Two Bridges
Mm-hmm.
Neighborhood Council, which really did a lot of that work on the National Register district. So they are
Yeah.
invested in that kind of history in their
Yeah,
communities.
I mean,
And that whole area is
the
fabulous.
Bowery Alliance definitely was, and Richard Moses and Lower East Side Preservation Initiative
Mm-hmm.
are. That said, looking at the list again this morning, I don't know either on the Bowery or on the Lower East Side at this point if there are any that are still extant that could be individually designated.
Oh, individually, I mean, I think that is the tough thing about those that as much as I personally love them, I think individual designation would be difficult. But there are certainly some that, um, I have like now an additional list of ones that I've seen pop up. Some favorites in that kind of Two Bridges area, what is now
Mm-hmm.
called Two Bridges, wasn't at the time.
Yeah.
Um, so there could be an addendum to the list of like additional ones, but I think you're right that like individual designation, that might be a little tricky.
Yeah, I mean, it does really point to also something that we talk about a lot in New York City about the landmarks law, which we love and need and want to keep strong, but that it really is somewhat prohibitive of being used for purposes of, where building lacks the complete integrity, the complete intact, individual landmark status is a very big deal. And the commission, has its policies, which are that the integrity of that building has to be pretty intact. And so these do not have that, but they have other values. Like there's ways in which we value these buildings.
Absolutely. And the cultural significance of, and
Right.
which I know that different individuals have submitted requests for evaluation to the commission on some of these with some extensive research, especially along the Bowery, where it's not about the integrity architecturally, even though they still have clearly federal elements, but for the historic, the significance and the cultural significance of those buildings in the community, and it just hasn't done it.
Well, that's really one of the dirtiest secrets of the commission, because the 35 and a half years that I was there, trust me, it was raised in the earliest days when I was on staff. And even though the commission talks a slightly different way about it, when push comes to shove, the buildings by and large that are designated for historic cultural reasons are still mostly intact and are mostly more high style architecture. Federal houses, when you really consider it, other than the really grand ones, are vernacular architecture.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
At its absolute elemental meaning. But that's what's, as you were talking about before, about Susan, some of your favorite examples on the Bowery. They are they should be protected for so many reasons.
For so many
Exactly.
reasons.
They are charming and they are vernacular and they speak to the history of New York, of Manhattan from, its earliest architecture. And that they have still survived is into the 21st century.
It's a miracle.
How in the world would one expect them to survive with every single detail intact? That's not the nature of New York. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've just a few minutes remaining. This has been a great conversation. I'm so glad we did this. I guess if there was any message you wanted, or maybe advice about what to do now, as for village preservation and its allies. If I know the interest there is very high in these buildings, both the ones that are in districts and the ones that are not. What would you advise them to do, if anything?
Well, I basically touched on it before. I think it's worth reaching out to other groups that are allies. I think it's worth village preservation specifically to do what we've done through this exercise, which is taking a fresh look in the original district and all of the adjunct surrounding districts, and what is there, what is vulnerable, what should they insist the commission take action and not be reactive to the vulnerable nature of some of these, and insist that the city put in place between the buildings department and the landmarks commission not lip service to protection, but serious protection.
So
and again,
kind of bumping up the watchdog.
Absolutely.
Efforts. Yeah.
And just not take for granted that just because these are designated individually or in historic districts, they're automatically protected, because that's turning out not to be the case.
Right.
And I think also there are more community organizations now than there were in the 90s. It's an opportunity, whether it be village preservation, whoever, to reach out to the different communities where these buildings are likely to be and just say, hey, do you have 5 on your watch list? What are those? What should we know is a priority in your neighborhood? And then how can we all pool our resources to make sure at least those that you have identified as significant in your neighborhood get some more attention as part of this whole group?
These are terrific suggestions, right? Some coalition building, some, checking with local communities about what's important to them and being vigilant, even if we think a building is protected when it may, still not survive.
Yeah.
And it's
Great.
actually, Susan, not to give you a task, but since you just admitted that you have an adjunct list to properties that were not on that list. I mean, we had talked before the camera went on that since you got the commission's list only south of 14th Street, I know for a fact that we had in our files buildings in Chelsea.
Yeah.
2 federal houses on 8th Avenue were designated by the commission. I used to live on West 16th Street, and there actually were some back then that were on 16th Street. So there are a number in Chelsea that are not designated. Although most of them have been severely altered in subsequent years, but it would be worth making that public if you have. In fact, I think as an aftermath of this conversation or fresh look of it, I'm going to compile a list of the ones that I think are individually designatable. And
Great.
again, just doing it again this
Great.
morning, I think it's probably less than 6 of that original list.
Right.
But if you could look at your resources and see if you think that there are any that are individually designatable, again, it's entirely possible in the future if the commission ever gets around to doing some tenement historic districts on Lower East Side, as the Bowery Alliance and Lesby is trying to do.
Right.
Some of them will get, scooped
Picked
up
in
those measures, but that's not a given.
No.
But again, my reading of going through all of the properties this morning on that original list that you took up, there's less than a handful that are that are still out there that are intact that I think could be designated.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll look through my files. I remember certainly when we were working on the project and kind of word got out that I received communication from people in Chelsea saying, hey, do you know about these buildings?
Yeah.
And then someone from Brooklyn, hey, we've got federals in Brooklyn. Do you know about these? So
Yeah.
I'll have to go through my files and my notes and also my photographs because I just, spent a lot of time roaming the Lower East Side and seeing what I've got.
But I do think, to your point earlier about community engagement and organizing, that you're right. There are probably folks in communities all over the city who would be thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. I'd love to join an effort like that. Maybe we should be looking at this on a broader geography. And finding partners outside of Lower Manhattan who are also thinking about the importance of these, and even to celebrate them, even if if out and out protection through policy measures is not possible, to really uplift the idea of them and draw attention to them through writing or exhibits or programs, or just to really kind of build the constituency of people who care about them and potentially could be stewards or advocates.
Yeah,
It's
and don't
actually
want to. Oh, go ahead, Jay.
Thinking this through as all of us are just formulating our own thoughts, it's rather ironic in a way that we have a Victorian society, a Art Deco society, Friends of Cast Iron, Friends of Terracotta, but there's never been a Federalist society.
Yes. Well, there is, but not for these buildings.
In terms of architecture.
It is true. This is a type of, a typology in a time period that doesn't have friends yet.
Well, and in that vein too, like we don't want to make this too broad, but certainly I've also looked at obviously all of the boroughs. And if we don't make it just strictly the federal style, if we're talking about this kind of early 19th century vernacular building, and obviously that federal form continued in some of the other boroughs into the 1850s, where that very basic style, or that Greek revival style, continued as well. Like if you're looking at that, you really have representation in every borough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of some kind of, early 19th century architecture that is important to the kind of residential typology of the borough.
Yeah.
Not as significant a number of federal buildings, but still something that kind of works in there, but that's getting pretty broad.
Maybe we need to start a little bit smaller with a friends group
Exactly.
for federal row houses and see how that goes.
Yeah.
See who comes out of, of obscurity to join an effort to celebrate these vulnerable resources. Okay, feels like a good time to wrap it up. Any last comment, last thoughts you want to throw in?
I'm so glad we had this conversation. As you
Yes.
said before,
Me
it's
too.
been instructive for the three of us. I hope ultimately whoever views this feels that
If
way.
anyone. Absolutely. No, this has been really fun, and yeah, we hopefully we can do this again. Okay. I am going to turn the recording off if I can remember how to do that. It's funny. Stop recording. There we go.